Last week, if you recall, we left off with Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden there in Genesis chapter 3. As we continue this one continuous story, and if you were to read further in the biblical text, what you'll see over the next several chapters is a pattern of sin that continues in the children of Adam and Eve. The world's first murder takes place as one of their sons, Cain, kills his brother, Abel, out of pride and out of jealousy. Cain marries and has a son. Now granted, the family tree hasn't branched out a whole lot at this point, but there weren't a whole lot of choices on eHarmony at this juncture. Adam and Eve, they have another son as well, Seth. Stick with me for a minute, just through a little bit of genealogy. If you look to Genesis chapter 5 in verse 4, we learn that Adam lived 800 years after Eve had Seth. And we also learn that they had many other sons and daughters. Now, why folks lived so long in these beginning times is completely left up to speculation. Certainly there was no processed sugar or hole in the ozone at this point. Who knows, maybe after these beginning generations, God just said, okay, that's a little much. These people are just too high maintenance. But if you look at Genesis chapter 5, verse 24, we have this wonderful description. Genesis 5, verse 24. This wonderful description of a descendant of Seth named Enoch. And the description that we have is that Enoch walked with God. The same description that we have of Adam and Eve as they walk with God in the garden in actuality, we have said in a spiritual sense of Enoch. Enoch was a man who walked with God. Oh, that the very same thing could be said of us. Enoch walked faithfully with God. From Enoch comes Methuselah, who lives 969 years. If you're looking for a little bit of Bible trivia, that's the oldest person listed in the Bible. You thought Grandpa was old, but Methuselah lived to be 969 years of age. After Methuselah comes Lamech. Stick with me, we're about to be out of the genealogy here. And then after Lamech comes Noah. And so I'm going to begin reading in Genesis chapter 6. And remember, the name Genesis means beginning. Genesis is a book of beginnings. And so read with me, if you will, Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that He had made human beings on the earth, and in His heart He was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created. With them the animals, the birds, the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. Verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and it was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Your version may read gopher wood. What I want you to pay attention to is as we read this account of the story of Noah and in the flood, what I want us to pay attention to is that God is grieved. He's grieved by the behavior of His created people. The events of the flood and Noah reveal the very heart of God. The Almighty God of heaven and earth, He's grieved by the sinful behavior of His creation, humankind, created in His image, and He's moved to action. And even though the events of the flood, they may sound harsh to us, what I want you to keep in mind is one very important detail. God He's not consulting us on this. Whether we understand or agree is of no consequence. God sets this into motion for His purposes. If you read the next several chapters of the Bible, if you look at Genesis chapter 6 through 9, God gives Noah specific and perfect dimensions and instructions, even what materials to use. I know many of you have gone up to the exhibit in Kentucky and you've seen the replica of these details. God, He speaks to Noah. Noah, who surely must have seemed crazy to the rest of the world, as those who walk with God often are. But God, He speaks to Noah. He tells Noah that he's going to send a great flood. But Noah is to build an ark, this great big ship. And along with his wife and his sons and their wives. They are going to take 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of every unclean animal. We'll talk more about this as we get into the sacrifices of Israel. But God gives Noah and his family specific instructions, and then divinely, all of this comes together through the faith of Noah and also the providence of God. Certainly the providence of God, because I imagine it would have been very difficult for Noah by himself to corral tigers and porcupines and all of that. And so through the faith of Noah, insert laughter at home, through the faith of Noah and the providence of God, after no doubt years and years and years and years, the first drop of rain falls. And all of humanity, whose every intention had been set on evil, is consumed by the flood. Genesis chapter 7, verse 4, lets us know that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, this is the first occurrence, but we have to pay attention in the Bible whenever we see the number 40. In the Bible, every time the number 40 is utilized, every time we see the number 40 within the biblical text, it indicates a time of testing. The number 40 designates a time of testing for humanity. Later we'll see that Moses spends 40 years in exile. Israel will spend 40 years in the wilderness. Jesus will fast, and He will be tested by the enemy for 40 days in the desert. In the Bible, the number 40 indicates a time of testing. And so after 40 days and 40 nights of rain, the water stops. But the world of ocean doesn't subside for another 150 days, if you look at Genesis chapter 7, verse 24. And so all in all, they're on the ark, not for an entire, but at least for the better part of a year, 190 days or more. Talk about some quality family time. You think things are getting a little testy in your house after some sheltering in place for a couple of weeks. And they didn't have things like seesaw school curriculum for their kids or Netflix to binge watch. And then after the waters finally subside, and the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and his daughters-in-law, 8 in all, as humanity, think about this, as humanity begins again. Remember we said that Genesis is a book of beginnings. As humanity begins again, and as the 8 of them step out of the ark onto dry ground, do you know what the first thing that they do is? The first thing that they do, the very first thing that they do is worship. The final verses of Genesis chapter 8 describe Noah building an altar to the Lord, offering sacrifices to the Lord. And the Lord, the text says, the Lord is pleased. Genesis chapter 8 verse 21 reads, the worship, the offering was a pleasing aroma to God. Now, I can't imagine inside the ark was a very pleasing aroma by this point. But the worship, the offering, the sacrifice is. And this moment of worship, in this construction of the altar, now where did the wood for the altar come from? The ark, perhaps. But in this moment of worship, and in this construction of the altar, and in this offering of sacrifice, this brings us to one of the central themes in the Bible: atonement. Atonement, one of the central themes of the Bible. And atonement simply means at one with God. Atonement means being at one with God. We'll consider later the sacrifices of atonement in God's covenant with Israel. The sacrifices that bring forgiveness and redemption that, of course, culminate in the gospel of Christ. But just think of the word atonement. At one meant. What Adam and Eve had in the garden with God before the fall, when they walked and when they talked with God, at one meant. This, of course, only ultimately accomplished through Christ. John will write in 1 John chapter 1, verse 7, that if we walk in the light as He is in the light, we have fellowship with one another. And the blood of Jesus, His Son, purifies us from all sin. In the next chapter, the Apostle John, in 1 John chapter 2, verse 2, he'll say that Jesus is our sacrifice of atonement. And not only for us, but for the whole world. Atonement means being at one with God. Being at one with God. Nothing at all in between us and God. Having the ability to be able to walk with God. Nothing hindering our capacity to walk and to talk with God. And I wonder if maybe even through all of the adversity that we're encountering right now, I wonder if perhaps especially right now, if we are not better situated even today to desire and to crave and to yearn, to long, to walk and talk with God. To have at one-ment with God. I wonder if maybe today we're not even better situated to consider our walk with God. I wonder if what was said of Noah and what was said of his great-grandfather Enoch can be said of us. that we are a people who walk with God. Are you a person? Are we a people who walk with God? If not, isn't it time to be in sync with and in step with God? The Apostle Peter, he will build upon the story of the flood. And he'll present how our stories intersect the greater story of God. 1 Peter chapter 3, beginning in the latter part of verse 20. God, He waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism, that now saves you also, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience toward God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven, and He's at God's right hand, with angels and authorities and powers in submission to Him. The Apostle Peter points us back to the events of Noah and the ark and recognizes that there's salvation amidst judgment for Noah and his family. There's salvation through this plan of God that's made possible as there's judgment enacted for humanity in the flood. There's a connection here between Noah and his family being saved through the ark. There's a connection here with how we are saved through the gospel of Jesus, as the ark is made out of wood, and as the cross of Christ is constructed out of wood. As you and I are saved by and through the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and how we submit to the gospel of Christ by being immersed into baptism. And at first glance, it might seem a little bit strange to us. Jason, how does this make sense? That in baptism, we're resurrected. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus Christ, Peter writes. How in baptism we're saved, but for those during the time of the flood, that water represented judgment and destruction. But it also represents the removal of sin from the earth. It represents the cleansing of the earth. And as we are baptized into Christ, we are cleansed. We're made new. We're made right with God. Everything in the Bible, every event, every story, every action, every moment, every page of the Bible points toward Jesus. And a core aspect of the story of the flood is the truth that every event in the Bible points toward Jesus as the Messiah and the salvation the gospel brings. We bear witness to the patience of God, the faithfulness of God, and the promises of God. The patience of God and the faithfulness of God and the promises of God amidst a people who so often, too often, go our own way. Scholar Tom Wright describes it like this: the Christian vocation, the Christian calling. The Christian vocation, the Christian calling is to be in prayer, in the Spirit, at the place where the world is in pain. And as we embrace that vocation, as we embrace that calling, we discover it to be the way of following Christ, shaped according to His messianic vocation, His calling to the cross. with arms outstretched. With arms outstretched, holding on simultaneously to the pain of the world and to the love of God. Sounds a little bit like loving God and loving others. Amidst a people who so often go our own way, the patience of God, the faithfulness of God, and the promises of God. Which leads us to one final passage. In Genesis chapter 9, you have the promise of God to Noah, this first covenant in the Bible. And we also see God's promises to us. Let me begin in verse 11 of Genesis 9. I'll read verses 11 through 17. God says this, "I will establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, 'This is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you, and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds. It will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember,'" or maybe it could also be said, "I will be reminded of my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all of life. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth." So God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I have established between me and all of life on the earth." This is the image that's intended by a rainbow. You see, whenever it's not just the image of a rainbow that we're familiar with, but it's the image of a bow that is hung, like a bow and arrow. When a warrior returns home from battle, he puts his weapons away. That's the image that's intended by God whenever we're reminded of a rainbow in the sky, whenever there's some rain. When a warrior returns from battle, he puts his weapons away. He hangs up his war bow up and out of the way. This image, the image of a rainbow that we're all at times reminded of in nature. This is a reminder of peace. It's an image of peace. The Creator had waged war against creation, but His pledge is that He will never do so again. The Apostle Paul will say even that while we were enemies of God, still Christ died for us. And the question that all of this from Noah and the flood asks is, are you at peace with God? Are you at peace with God? God accepts you as you are. If in sin He loves us too much to leave us there, but He accepts us as we are. He creates renewal. We see this in the flood, and we see it in Jesus. God, He creates renewal. His mercies are new every morning. Our God is the God of starting over. But are you at peace with Him? He's the God of renewal. He's the God of second and third, and we can't keep count. Chances. He's the God of renewal. But are you at peace with Him? I said last week that if as a church family, if we can walk alongside of you, it would be our honor. If we can pray for you, just get in touch with one of our shepherds, one of our ministers. We would be honored to be able to to journey alongside of you, to pray over you. If you're not at peace with God, to begin to make decisions today, to be at peace with Him, and for us to walk alongside of you in that process. Renewal and peace, they are what God offers. If you've never been baptized into Christ, we can still do that, even during this time of social distancing. Let us know. Make the decision today to be a child of God. Renewal and peace. We see these things in the story of Noah. We see them in the story of all stories, the story of Jesus. Renewal and peace are what God offers. Let's sing, church.